What are the ramifications of Donald Trump's upcoming trade policy? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, and we have done that for 34 years here at FFF. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, who was with us here at FFF when we first got started back in 1989. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to be with you and, of course, our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support. So, Richard, one of the big aspects of the upcoming Donald Trump presidency is going to relate to free trade, tariffs, trade wars, to a certain extent, sanctions, embargoes, restrictions on the ability of people to buy and sell internationally, or at least on Americans to buy and sell internationally, but also controls on foreigners. So I thought we ought to devote an extensive libertarian angle, an entire libertarian angle to this issue, because I think it's so important and it really goes to the heart of some of the economic principles that we enunciate as libertarians, which, needless to say, are totally contrary to what Trump is advocating. To me, it's absolutely shocking that we still have to talk about free trade after all these years. I mean, we've been advocating principles of free trade for 34 years here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. And I think if there's anything that unites libertarians in an economic sense, it's free trade. I mean, I don't know of any libertarian that advocates tariffs and trade restrictions. And the case for free trade has been made so solidly. I mean, going all the way back to Adam Smith with his great book, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and then through the classical economists who we've discussed here in the Libertarian Angle and up to the Austrian economists. So let me just start out with just the basic principle that we're dealing with, and then I'll turn it over to you. That we start out with the idea that in every trade, both sides benefit. It's just an axiom. That is to say that when I enter into a trade with you, you benefit and I benefit. We both benefit. Now, in other words, there's not a loser and a winner. Now, how do I know that? Well, because the trade is voluntary. And in the trade, you're giving up something that you value less for something that you value more. Same for me. Since it's a consensual voluntary trade, I'm giving up something that I value less to get something I value more. Our standard of living has increased at the moment of the exchange. We have both bettered our condition. So let's say that you've got 10 apples and I've got 10 oranges, and I give you 9 oranges and you give me 1 apple. Is this a so-called fair trade? Of course it is. We both have given up something we value less for something we value more. And it's that basic principle of free trade that really forms the foundation of economic benefit, of rising standards of living. In other words, you could have a society that doesn't have any factories and manufacturers, and the simple act of free trade, of people trading goods and services, can increase standards of living for people. Now, obviously, there's other factors like the accumulation of savings and capital and productivity that increase standards of living. But what I want to emphasize is that trade increases standards of living. This is how standards of living rise, or one of the ways. So the corollary to that is pretty obvious. To the extent that government interferes with this process, to that extent, the government is not only depriving people of freedom, which we can talk about later in this program, but it's interfering with the ability to increase their standard of living. What do you think?
Well, building on that, you said imagine two individuals one who has product X and one who has product Y. And each of them values more highly some quantity of the product the other person has and values less highly in comparison some quantity of the product currently in their possession. And we would be willing to give up the X for the Y, or respectively the other person the Y for the X, and that they're both would be better off. It's absolutely true. The problem that hounds us, given the mindset of the protectionists, the tariff builders, is they don't think in terms of individuals. They think in terms of collectives, groups, the nation state. Let's take Donald Trump. He has no problem, I believe, with New Yorkers trading with people in Connecticut. He has no problem with people in Idaho buying and selling chosen goods and services at prices they may agree upon between those in Idaho and in California. What he objects to is this idea that Americans may purchase goods from other individuals in a different nation state, China, France, Brazil, uh, whatever. That is what he objects to, because he believes that the unit of analysis, the unit of importance, is the collective, in this case, the nation state, as opposed to the individual, and that therefore the individual must sacrifice his preferences, his desires, to improve the circumstances of this collective entity, which he defines not just as an entity, but a certain measurement of prosperity. For example, what does Trump say he wants? He wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And he wants to use domestic taxes and import duties as the means by which he can induce, influence, persuade, strong arm, can I say, maybe some manufacturing activities done in other countries to the United States, so that by going into the United States, they jump over the tariff barrier and not have those import costs to undertake their lines of business. Will that require some American consumers and producers to have to sacrifice their individual betterment and interests for the greater good of this nation state definition of better as defined by Trump? Absolutely. That's what he's willing to do. Now he tries to sugarcoat it by saying, oh no, the importer, the exporting country, excuse me, the exporting country, they pay the tariff. The American consumer isn't going to pay. Oh, American businesses will prosper and costs will go down. Well, as they usually sometimes say in the TV game shows, wrong. It doesn't work that way. The fact is that a tariff is nothing more than a tax, and it's part of the cost of doing business from the producer's point of view. Let's suppose that we have a manufacturer in France. He produces a product. He has his costs of production, and he evaluates whether the anticipated selling price is worth incurring those expenses in France, as opposed to investing his capital and savings in some other possibly profitable endeavor. And now he has transportation costs, because he may not only have to transport his good from some regional area in France to Paris, with that is selling his good within his own country, but there might be transportation costs to export part of his produce to the United States and sell it there. So now he has to evaluate, well, what about the expenses of my manufacturing and the transportation across the Atlantic through one means of transportation or another, and then selling it to the American consumer? Would it still be profitable? Can my selling price still justify this? And then he has to have another expense if Trump has his way. There's the import duty. The good can't come in unless the import duty is paid. So now he has to decide production costs, transportation costs, tax costs. Now he'll say, if I pay the tax, can I still sell the product profitably? Well, only if I raise my price. Just as if I can't get the good to market from my regional area in France to Paris unless I decide whether I can include my transportation expenses and still make a profit. I have to raise the price to cover my transportation expenses. Will I still be profitable? But the price still gets raised. And who's going to pay that higher raised price? The American consumer. What about the American producer who imports component parts, resources, raw materials? from other countries so that he can do his manufacturing in the United States to have his finished product, either to sell to Americans or to himself export it to some buyer abroad. Now, all of his import costs are raised by the value of the tax. So who pays ultimately this? Well, as economists would say, it depends upon the elasticity of demand. That's just a fancy jargon for saying if the price goes up by X%, will the person's sales revenues increase or decrease? And he'll make that calculation. But the fact is, the American consumer and the producers of imported inputs will find that they pay a higher price and purchase less of the good. And as a consequence, the American producer and consumer is going to be worse off. Yet it is true, the foreign seller may sell less. But you know what that means? He earns fewer dollars. And if he earns fewer dollars, he has less of the financial wherewithal to do what? To pay for and purchase American export. So that reduces the export markets of the American manufacturer, as well as harming the American importers as consumers or producers. And cumulatively, all of us are worse off. We end up consuming less and at higher prices. In other words, that is the opposite of progress. It's regressive. That's a lower level of economic well-being, a lower level of economic prosperity, a lower level of improving people's lives. That is why it is advantageous to allow free trade. It doesn't matter where the producer is, Jacob, whether it's Joe across the street or Francois outside of Paris. From my point of view, if the American producer can sell me something for $10, and now that French producer can sell it to me for $5, given all of his production and free trade transportation costs, I'd rather pay $5. And you know what? I now have the product that previously was costing me 10 for 5. I now have an extra $5 left over in my pocket, which enables me to buy things that I financially could not afford before. I am now that much to the good and better off. My standard of living rises. And if that American producer cannot match his French competitor in devising less and better cost efficient ways of producing to match the $5, then he's going to have to finish change what he produces. Some workers may have to change jobs. But where will the profit opportunities and the jobs come from if that line of production in America has to be reduced? Well, the American has that extra $5 in his pocket. He's going to have $5 to spend on other products that he would also like, but previously he couldn't afford. That raises the demands for other things, out of which will come the alternative profit opportunities for some manufacturers and some workers to be employed and involved in production in producing other things that Americans did not have the financial wherewithal to be able to take advantage of in the past. At the end of the day, all of us are better off. Now, if people usually say, but that's the long run. What about the short run? Yeah, in the short run, the world changes. But that would be like saying, let's say 200 years ago, you know what? Progress creates problems. I have to change my job. I have to learn new skills. I've been producing a product for profit X, and now I have to look for an alternative product to make, and maybe it will be profit X or not. Oh, change creates too much disruption. It disrupts my way of life. Let's stop it. Well, let's suppose the government had frozen the American environment of 200 years ago. What would our standards of living be? What would be the amenities and conveniences and luxuries? It would be the same of 200 years ago. The fact is, progress involves adaptation and change. In fact, it's the innovator, the creator, the imaginer who creates new opportunities out of which rising standards of living come, to which people have to adapt. As Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian-born economist, expressed it, it's a process of creative destruction. The better replaces the older ways of doing things, but makes us better in the process of it. And that involves international trade. So the fact is that besides interfering with the freedom of two people who want to enter into exchange and decide that each views themselves as better off through the transaction than if not, by giving up what they value less highly for something they value more highly, the wider cumulative process, it makes all in the society worse off, lowering the standards of living or delaying improvements in the standard of living and harming the economic circumstances of multitudes of individuals in the nation of Donald Trump's or any similar person's conception of the national interest. there is no national interest. There is no common good. There's no public welfare independent of and separate from the betterments and the interests and the welfare of individuals as understood and defined by themselves.
Yeah, you raised a lot of good points. One of your best points is the idea that we should be looking at this situation from the standpoint of our role as consumers. That as consumers, we want a better life. I mean, most people want a better life, economically speaking. And so when we look at it from the standpoint of the consumers, the more people that are flooding us with opportunities to buy with good products, sound products, inexpensive products, the better off we are. Your point about Trump and his mindset of nationalism and nation state is really a great one too. When you analyzed it on a state level, that he has no problem with people in New York buying from people in Connecticut and vice versa. It doesn't have to be that way. If you have that kind of mindset, then what would be wrong with people of Connecticut putting on tariffs and import restrictions from people in New York? Same mindset. Oh, we can better the people of Connecticut by not having New Yorkers flood us with their products and so forth. It's the same principle as you point out. If I'm buying a product and it's a good product, what do I care that it's produced by somebody in Connecticut, New York, or China, or Russia? What difference does it make? I'm interested as a consumer in the best product I can find at the cheapest possible price. And this process of trade obviously builds up interdependencies, that people start getting accustomed to saying, hey, we're buying our parts from China. So what? We're getting good products. It's that division of labor. And the same from the Chinese perspective. Hey, man, we got customers that are Americans we're selling to. This is fantastic. It develops friendships between people of different countries, even if they don't even speak the same language. They're able to create this amicable relationship. Well, so when Trump, the last time around when he was president, initiated this trade war against China, it was like he really sees it as a war, that I'm going to go to war against these people and I'm going to win it, because he says I'm very good at trade wars. Well, what he's thinking in terms of is that the Chinese government's going to say, "Oh, we surrender to you. We surrender. You started this war. We will, you can go ahead and raise all your tariffs that you want. We won't do it. You'll continue getting our goods for cheap and a good price and so forth. Oh, we surrender. You can do whatever you want to us." Well, that's not the way life works. Now, you and I both know that the best response of the Chinese government would have been, don't retaliate. Just wait till the American people come to their senses and force this guy to drop this trade war. But that's not what happens in the real world. The Chinese say, okay, you're going to do this. You're going to hurt our manufacturers, our suppliers. I mean, that's what Trump is intending to do. He is targeting Chinese businessmen and saying, I'm going to damage you. I'm going to hurt you by not letting Americans buy from you. That means that you're going to have loss of market share. You may even go out of business. Good riddance, because you're a Chinese. You're not an American. Well, the Chinese government, as we all know, when these things get started, they say, oh, well, then we're going to retaliate against your wheat producers. And so, sure enough, they raise tariffs and import restrictions on the importation of American wheat. And so, what ends up happening? Farmers were going bankrupt here in the United States because of the retaliation that started with Trump's trade war. And as they were going into bankruptcy, what was Trump's response? Oh, I'll give them a welfare payment. I'll send them some money from the federal government. Well, that's not what life's all about. That's not what people want in life. Those farmers weren't interested in a welfare payment and going into bankruptcy court. They were interested in doing what they were doing before, maintaining this amicable, harmonious economic relationship with Chinese citizens. So it's very, very damaging. But the other thing I want to point out, Richard, here is it's also the destruction of American liberty. And that's really what we're all about here at FFF. We want to live in a free society, and a free society necessarily means free trade. because it's my money. I have a right to do whatever I want with my money, or it's my business, it's my manufacturing company, it's my selling of these goods and services that I'm importing from China. I have a right to buy whatever I want to buy from whomever I want to buy. This is also the fundamental concept of freedom of association. You have a right to associate with whomever you want, Chinese, Russian, Venezuelan, Guatemalan, Mexican, whatever, and buy goods and services from them. This is an essential aspect of being a free individual. This is what Trump doesn't realize, or maybe he does and he doesn't care. But if you want to live in a free society, that is necessarily a society that is based on the principles of free trade. And so what is the real libertarian position on free trade? Unilateral free trade. Just drop all your trade restrictions, all your import duties, your tariffs. Drop all the restrictions on the freedom of the American people to buy and sell with whomever they want to buy and sell anywhere in the world. Don't worry about negotiating anything. Those other countries, they'll figure it out. If they have tremendous protectionist walls, okay, well then free Americans simply won't be able to penetrate those walls. So be it. But free the American people unilaterally, regardless of what other nations do.
I'll just amplify on your last point that I can imagine some viewers or listeners saying, I understand the point Jacob and you and Richard are making, but we live in the real world. And a government, a society just can't unilaterally do this. You have to do something. Well, historically, that's not how modern free trade emerged. Modern free trade emerged in Great Britain through the agitation of the free trade advocates in the 1820s, the 1830s, finally culminating in the anti-corn laws uh, that were passed in 1846. And the British did this by unilaterally lowering a vast amount of their agricultural and increasing their manufacturing tariffs against foreign imports. And their philosophy, starting with Richard Cobden, John Bright, and the prime minister at that time, who they persuaded over to that free trade point of view, Sir Robert Peel, was that just do this. If it's right, just do it. Or as Robert Peel said in his farewell address as prime minister before the Tories kicked him out, because he had been the Tory leader who betrayed them going over to the liberal free traders. If other nations wish to buy high and sell low, let them do so. But if the wise policy is to buy in the cheapest market and look for the best market to sell our products, we should follow that intelligent and judicious policy and by our example and improving our circumstances serve as a beacon for other countries to follow us in a free trade policy. But regardless of whether they do or not, we should just go our own way if it is sound reasoning in terms of prosperity and freedom. That's what Sir Richard Peel said as he gave up his prime ministership in the defense of a principle of legislation. And Britain then served as the example for this. Other countries had their tariffs. Some they lowered, others not. The Germans then started re-raising their tariffs in the 1870s and 1880s. But until the First World War, even with a re-emerging protectionist agitation in Great Britain itself, do you know what Britain followed? Unilateral free trade. Anybody could virtually go anywhere within the global encompassing British Empire, freely move, freely sell goods and services, freely invest their capital, freely withdraw their capital, regardless of their citizenship or nationality. All people were viewed just as individuals taking advantage of the mutual gains from trade in a global division of labor. That should be the principle and the ideal. And it worked and it was practiced. And you know what? We should learn from people's mistakes and we should also learn from other people's successes.
Yeah, that's a great story of the free trade movement in Great Britain that was led by Richard Cobden and John Bright. They achieved success while Frederick Bastiat over in France,
Did
who
not.
I think was a much better exponent of free trade principles, he really failed to get France to go along. But the fascinating thing about the free trade movement in Britain was that it was led largely by poor people who recognized the virtues of free trade for the poor. And you showed me once, a long time ago, a picture of people protesting in favor of free trade, which were poor people that had a banner that said "free trade or this," and it was a cannon. It was
That was
like,
that was oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. He was a very famous Irish member of Parliament from Kent County Kerry. Oh God, I'm blanking on his name. But he was leading the free trade elements for Ireland in Great Britain. And so they would have these free trade demonstrations in Ireland. And at least in one of them, uh, a cannon was pulled through the streets of various towns and villages with the slogan free trade or this. Or that there'd be poor kids starving due to the food protectionism that kept high prices for the British aristocracy owning the agricultural land at the expense of the poor ordinary citizen. And one historian recounted that graffiti had been written on a wall in London. I be protected and I be starved. So
that's
it was
awesome.
understood that free trade, unrestricted buying and selling, as people found it economically most advantageous, was not something for the rich, but in fact was the policy most likely to improve the conditions of the poor.
Yeah, in our waning moments here, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention sanctions and embargoes as part of all this, because it's the same principle. We've had this economic embargo on the people of Cuba for, well, I don't know, 60 years or so. And it's designed to target the citizenry of a different country with impoverishment and even death by starvation. It's horrific. Uh, and we've had that embargo. It's a means to try to achieve a political end, regime change, and a brutal embargo against the people of Iran. I mean, the list of people who are targeted with sanctions and embargoes is very, very long, and it's a cruel, inhumane policy. It's based on the same principle of terrorism, target civilians as a way to achieve a political goal. But more equally important is the fact that it is a destruction of our own liberty. If you go to Cuba and you spend money there without government permission, US government permission, they will indict you, convict you, and put you in jail for a certain period of time and fine you for daring to violate their little sacred rules and restrictions. So it's a classic example of when they're targeting foreigners with death or impoverishment as a way to achieve a political goal. It is also their excuse to control us here at home.
Yeah, a long time ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, the famous classical liberal philosopher Herbert Spencer wrote an essay on slavery. And he said, when the slave master puts a rope around the slave, he restricts the movement of the slave, but he also restricts his own movement, because how does he control the movements of the slave without holding the other end of the rope and there being confined to in his own movements to what he has to do to control the actions of the slave? So when we impose these restrictions, controls, regulations, prohibitions, tariffs, we end up restricting and restraining and limiting our own liberties as well as the others whom we're targeting.
All right, that's a great point. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you, Richard. Greatly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in and for your support. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next time.
Until next time.